A Dozen Bloomin' Roses by Paul Jennings. See, this kid was hanging round outside the flower shop, and Jenny, the shop assistant, thought he was a troublemaker. She reckoned he might be going to nick something, and that's why she called me. I have a black belt in judo, if I do say so myself. I'm quite good in a fight. Not that I'm tough. No, generally I'm as quiet as a lamb. Not big either. In fact, a lot of people think I'm about 14 years old, and they're amazed when I tell them I'm really 17. I got the job at the flower shop because of my strength. They needed someone strong who could lump all the boxes around and lift heavy flower pots for Jenny. At first they didn't want me on account of my size, but when they saw what I could do, they changed their minds and gave me the job. Anyway, to get back to the story, this kid, who looked about my age, really was acting strangely. He would peer into the shop looking at the flowers for sale. When anyone looked at him, he sloped off down the street. About 5 minutes later, he would come back. This happened about 20 times. I should add that I thought I'd seen him hanging around before. Perhaps on the train. Don't worry, I said to Jenny. I'll fix this weirdo up in no time at all. I walked out of the door and approached the boy who was acting so strangely. Straight away he turned around and started to walk off. Hey, come back here, I ordered in my sternest voice. I want to talk to you. He turned around and went red in the face. I could see that he was nervous. His knees were wobbling like jelly, and he just stood there with his mouth dangling open. What are you hanging around here for? I asked. I started to feel a bit sorry for him. He looked so nervous, and I had a feeling maybe he had a bit of a sweet for Jenny. I have to admit, she is the spunkiest girl in all of Melbourne, and he wouldn't have been the first one who fancied her. He seemed to have trouble talking. It was as if he was being strangled by invisible hands, but finally he managed to gasp out the word, flowers. I grabbed his arm firmly and led him into the shop counter. Here, I said, giving a wink to Jenny. This gentleman wants flowers. Jenny turned on her fatal smile and said in her sweetest voice, What sort of flowers, sir? I grinned to myself. She always called the shy ones sir, made them feel better when they were embarrassed about buying flowers. The poor kid went even redder and looked around wildly. He obviously didn't know a kangaroo paw from a carnation. Roses, he blurted out, pointing out to our most expensive line. Should tell you here what I found out later at the funeral. This poor boy had $26 in his pocket. 20 of it was the change from his grandmother's pension cheque, and 6 of it was his own. His grandmother needed his money badly to buy her week's groceries. Jenny looked at the roses. Good choice, she said. They're beautiful, aren't they? How many would you like? Once again, he struggled for words. How much? You see... Boy, he was the shyest person I'd ever seen. He just couldn't seem to get anything out. Finally, the words, 1 dozen, managed to escape from his frozen mouth. Jenny started to wrap up the roses. She always goes to a lot of trouble to make them look good. She wraps the stems up in pretty paper, then gets a long length of ribbon and ties a bow. Next, she runs one of her long, slender fingernails along the ends of the ribbon, and they curl up like magic. I've tried to do this myself many times, but it never works. Probably because I bite my fingernails. Are they for your girlfriend? Asked Jenny. She's a bit on the nosy side, is Jenny. The red-faced boy shook his head, and he looked at his shoes. They are for a girl, though, aren't they? He nodded. Is this the first time you have given flowers to a girl? She asked gently. He nodded again and made a gurgling noise in his throat. What should I write on the card? I could see that Jenny felt sorry for this kid. She was trying to help him all she could. Poor thing couldn't seem to talk at all. How about your name? She suggested. You'll have to put who they're from. Gerald, he answered at last. My name's Gerald. Jenny smiled. And who are they for? She asked kindly. He didn't know which leg to stand on. He was really embarrassed. He looked at me as if I wished I wasn't there. Oh, go away, said Jenny. You're embarrassing the customer. She was the boss, so I went back to the back of the shop, started stacking up some heavy concrete pots. Jenny wrote something on the card and tied it to the ribbon. I snuck around behind a row of daffodils so that I could see what happened. I really hoped things would work out well for this shy boy. Jenny put the finishing touches on the bunch and passed over the flowers. Now, she went on, they're $2 each. It'll be $24. Forget about Gerald being red in the face before. That was nothing compared to what happened next. He went as red as the dozen bloomin' roses he'd just bought. This great wave of redness swept down from his ears, down his neck, and for all I know, right down to his toes. Jenny and I didn't know what was the matter. It was only later I found out he thought flowers were $2 a bunch at the most. He'd got Jenny to wrap up the flowers, and now he couldn't ask her to take them back. He was too embarrassed. He pulled his grandmother's pension money out of his pocket, looked at it frantically, and thrust it into Jenny's hand. For a minute I thought he was going to say something to me. I tried to look as if I hadn't been listening. He took a few steps towards me, then changed his mind, grabbed his change and fled out of the shop. "A strange bloke," I said. "Bet we never see him again." I was wrong. Half an hour later he got into the same carriage as me on the train. I groaned. Not because of Gerald and his flowers, but because Scouse, the skinhead, was in my carriage. He was a great big hulk of a bloke, and he was real mean to bargain. He liked nothing better than picking on anyone weak and giving them a hard time. He always caught the same train as me, but I usually managed to get into another carriage. He looked at Gerald, gave a twisted sneer, and then spat on the floor. Gerald was as red as ever, and he stood with his back to the door, holding the flowers behind his back. He was trying to hide them from the other passengers. He didn't want to be seen carrying flowers in the train, and every now and then he looked over at me in an agitated fashion. The train was one of those silver ones where the two side doors slide automatically into the middle when they close. As the train lurched off, they shut with a bang, right on Gerald's roses. He just stood there shivering and twitching and holding onto the stems with his hands behind his back as if nothing happened. The stems were on the inside of the train and the flowers were on the outside. Everyone on the train started to grin. I bit my tongue like mad to stop myself from smiling. I had to admit it was a bit funny. Gerald just looked at the spot on the roof and stood there with his hands behind his back, pretending nothing had happened. A few people started twittering and giggling. Poor kid just didn't know what to do, so he kept on pretending that everything was all right. Gerald looked around desperately. I'm sure that if the door had been open, he would have jumped out of the moving train just to escape the mirth. The only person in the train who hadn't noticed the flowers was Scouse. He was too busy scratching his shaved head and taking swigs out of a tinny. Every now and then he'd give a loud burp. The train plunged into a tunnel and everything went black. I stopped biting my tongue and allowed myself a big grin. I couldn't help it. Anyway, Gerald couldn't see me smiling in the dark, and right at that moment the light switched on, and Gerald looked into my eyes. He'd seen me grinning. His bewildered eyes seemed to say, "Not you too." It was at this moment I'd realized I'd betrayed him. I forced the smile from my face and opened my mouth to speak, but he looked away just as the train stopped at an underground station. The door slid apart, and Gerald stared at what was left of his $24 bunch of flowers. They'd gone. He stood there lamely, holding 12 broken stems wrapped in pink paper. There was not one petal left. They'd all been ripped off in the tunnel. Now he'd lost his grandmother's money and his flowers, and even worse, he'd made a fool of himself in front of a whole carriage of people, including me. With a strangled cry, he jumped off onto the platform. Scouse jumped after him. "Look at the little fairy clutching his invisible flowers," sneered Scouse. I stepped off the train too and stood aside as it sped past me. Scouse snatched the rose stems from Gerald's hand gleefully. "Look at this," he mocked as he read the card that Jenny had written. "To Samantha, with love from Gerald. I bet she likes getting these." He shoved the prickly stems into Gerald's face. Gerald grabbed the broken stalks and looked around like a hunted rabbit. He looked straight at me, red with shame. He wanted to escape, but Scouse was blocking his way. Without a sound, Gerald jumped off the platform onto the tracks and ran up the tunnel. "Hey, come back!" I shouted. "Trains come through that loop every 5 minutes." He made no reply, and I heard his clattering feet disappear into the tunnel. "Let the fairy go," showing his yellow teeth with a leer. He spat into my face and walked off laughing. I ran screaming down the platform to find a porter. There's a boy in the tunnel," I yelled. "Stop the trains!" The ground began to rumble gently, and a rush of cold air came out of the tunnel. There was a low rumble, and then a scream. The train rushed out of the tunnel. As it slowed, I noticed a bunch of broken flower stems wedged on one of the buffers. There weren't many people at Gerald's funeral. Apart from the priest and the undertakers, there was just me and Gerald's grandmother. After the coffin had been lowered into the ground, we walked slowly back to the gate. I told the old lady about what had happened in the flower shop. She already knew the rest from the police. She smiled sadly and explained about her pension money that he'd spent. "Not that I care about that," she said. "If only I had Gerald back, I'd give anything I have." I watched with tears in my eyes as the bent old lady slowly walked off. I told her about the rat-bag Scouse, but I didn't mention that I'd smiled on the train when the roses got caught in the door. I just felt too ashamed. That night I had terrible dreams about roses and thorns. I kept seeing a dark tunnel from which a lonely voice sadly called my name. It was no better that day at work. I kept dropping things and breaking them. The palm of my hand was itchy. I kept scratching it without nothing would stop the itch. I was glad when it was time to knock off. Went out into the potting shed to get my parka. A terrible feeling of sadness suddenly swept over me. It seemed to flow out into my body from the palm of my left hand. And then it happened. From the palm of my left hand, a red rose erupted from my flesh. Slowly it unfolded, budded, and bloomed, a magnificent flower nodding gently on the end of a graceful stem. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I shook my head wildly, and my rose fell to the ground. I fell in a chair, dazed, and watched with horror. No, not horror. Awe, as 11 more perfect blooms grew out from the palm of my hand. I knew after the third one there would be a dozen Bloomin' roses, blood red each, with 2 dots in each perfect petal. Under the dots, a downturned line. I stared at the dots. They were eyes, unhappy eyes, and underneath, a little sad suggestion of a mouth. Each petal of each rose had a portrait of the dead boy's face. I knew that Gerald had sent me a message from beyond the grave. I collected the roses in a daze and took them into the shop. Then I wrapped them in pink paper and tied them up with a bow. I ran and chewed fingernail along the ends and curled them up. After that, I wrote on a small card and attached it to the ribbon. Then I set off for home. Scouse was on the train. He leered as soon as he saw me. I stood with my back to the sliding doors, and as they slid closed, I let the roses become trapped in the door. I stood there, saying nothing as the train lurched off. There was no one in the carriage except Scouse. "Another little person with flowers in the door," he mocked. He stood up and poked me in the stomach. It hurt. "Another sap, another creep who buys flowers." I grabbed his wrist with my one free hand and tried to stop him from jabbing me. Just at that moment the train plunged into the tunnel, and Scouse broke my hold in the blackness. I felt his powerful arms on my neck, and I fought desperately for breath. I was choking. He was strangling me. I felt my life ebbing away, but I just couldn't bring myself to let go of those flowers, so I only had one free hand, and I couldn't stop him. Without warning, the doors burst apart as if opened by giant arms. A roaring and rushing filled the carriage. A sweet smell of roses engulfed us. The hands released my neck, and Scouse screamed with terror. As the light flicked on, I saw that the compartment was filled with rambling roses. They twisted and climbed at astonishing speed. They covered the luggage racks and the safety rails. They twisted along the seats and completely filled the compartment. I couldn't move. Then I saw the long tendrils went around Scouse's legs and arms and neck. Tighter and tighter they drew around the hapless man's throat, until at last he lay on the floor. I knew he was dead. Then, as quickly as they'd come, the creeping roses snaked out of the door and vanished into the black tunnel. There was not a sign that they'd ever been there, except the 12 roses that I'd started with. They were perfectly intact, not damaged a bit by the exposure to the tunnel. I smoothed down my dress and picked up the bunch of roses as the train stopped at the station. I looked again at the label I'd written. It said, "To Gerald, with love from Samantha." When I got home, Mum was amazed by the roses. "Why, Samantha," she said, "they're beautiful, and look, each petal has 2 little dots that look like eyes, and a little line just like a mouth. They're faces." I could feel tears forming in my eyes. "Yes," I said. I examined them closely, and each little face is smiling.